In the year 632 AD, a man died in a small desert city called Medina. No imperial army stood at his funeral. No golden throne marked his power. No marble palace cast its shadow over his grave. And yet, within a single generation of his death, his followers would control lands stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of India. They would shatter two superpowers, redraw the political map of the known world, and ignite a civilization that would reshape science, law, faith, and empire for over 1,000 years. How did a community born in the sands of Mecca rise with such astonishing speed? And why did even modern Western historians describe their expansion as almost unbelievable? Tonight, we uncover the rise of the Caliphate and the empire that moved faster than history itself, because what happened next, no one in Rome or Persia saw coming. Welcome to a journey into the fault lines of history, where empires fall, unlikely powers rise, and moments that seem small change the world forever. This is the story of the early caliphate, born from faith, forged in war, driven by conviction, and propelled by forces far more complex than legend alone. By the end of this hour, you won't just understand how the Islamic Empire expanded, you'll understand why it expanded so fast. And the answer might surprise you. Because this wasn't just conquest, it was timing, belief, collapse, and opportunity. To understand the rise of the Caliphate, we must begin before Islam, before revelation, before armies, before empire. We start in 6th century Arabia, a land many outsiders dismissed as peripheral, tribal, and politically insignificant. But that perception was dangerously misleading. Arabia sat between two exhausted giants. To the northwest stood the Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome, centered in Constantinople. To the northeast loomed the Sasanian Persian Empire, ruled from Ctesiphon. For centuries, these two titans fought devastating wars across Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. The latest round? A brutal, generation-spanning conflict from 602 to 628 AD. Cities burned, treasure drained, armies shattered. The Persians captured Jerusalem. The Byzantines counterattacked deep into Persian lands. And by the time peace was declared, both empires were financially crippled and militarily exhausted.
But while Rome and Persia bled each other dry, something new was forming in the desert. Arabia itself was divided into tribes, fiercely independent, often in conflict. Loyalty was local. Blood ties mattered more than borders. In Mecca, trade caravans linked the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. Religion was diverse. Polytheism dominated, but Jewish and Christian communities thrived across the peninsula. Then, around 610 AD, a merchant named Muhammad began preaching monotheism. His message was radical: one God, moral accountability, social justice, equality before divine law. At first, he was mocked, then persecuted. In 622 AD, he and his followers migrated to Medina, an event known as the Hijra. It marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. In Medina, Muhammad was not only a spiritual leader, he became a political and military one. Tribal divisions began dissolving under a new identity, the Ummah, a community bound not by blood, but by belief. And that shift, from tribe to faith-based polity, would change everything.
By 630 AD, Muhammad had returned to Mecca. The city surrendered with minimal bloodshed. The Kaaba was rededicated to monotheism. Arabia, once fragmented, was largely unified under Islam. But unity did not guarantee stability. When Muhammad died in 632 AD, many tribes reconsidered their allegiance. Some refused to pay taxes, others declared new prophets. The fragile unity of Arabia began to crack. Would this new movement collapse, as so many charismatic-led movements had before? Or would it harden into something far more powerful? The answer began with a man named Abu Bakr, and his first decision would determine whether Islam remained a regional faith or became a world power.
In 632 AD, the desert held its breath. The prophet was gone. No clear succession blueprint had been written. No imperial constitution waited in the archives. No hereditary dynasty stood ready to assume command. And in that fragile vacuum, power could fracture. Almost immediately, tribes across Arabia began to pull away. Some claimed their allegiance had been to Muhammad personally, not to a state. Others refused to pay zakat, the communal tax. A few leaders even declared themselves prophets. To many observers, this looked like the beginning of the end. Because if Arabia collapsed back into tribal chaos, there would be no caliphate, no empire, no expansion. The man chosen to lead was not young, not flamboyant, not militarily legendary. His name was Abu Bakr,
A close companion of Muhammad, calm, resolute, unshakably principled. He took the title Caliph, successor, not prophet, not king. But his first test was brutal. The so-called Ridda Wars, wars of apostasy, erupted across the peninsula. Tribal confederations rebelled. Armed uprisings flared in central and eastern Arabia. Abu Bakr faced a choice: compromise or crush rebellion. He chose force, not out of ambition, but conviction. He believed that if the unity forged in Medina fractured, the entire religious and political project would disintegrate. So he dispatched armies across Arabia. Commanders like Khalid ibn al-Walid led swift, decisive campaigns. Battle after battle followed. Within a year, rebellion was broken. Arabia was unified again, this time not by charisma alone, but by state authority.
and suddenly thousands of battle-hardened warriors stood united, with no enemy left at home. What do you do with an energized, mobilized society built around conviction and military cohesion? History has an answer. You look outward. To the north lay the Byzantine provinces of Syria. To the northeast, the Persian-controlled lands of Iraq. Both empires were still reeling from decades of mutual destruction. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius had only recently reclaimed lost territories from Persia. His treasury was strained. His armies were depleted. Meanwhile, the Sasanian Empire under Yazdegerd III was in political turmoil, assassinations, succession crises, internal dissent. The superpowers looked mighty on maps, but on the inside, they were brittle.
And Abu Bakr saw the cracks. At first, the raids northward may have seemed like traditional Arabian expeditions, limited, opportunistic, seasonal. But something shifted. The early Muslim leadership did not simply raid. They stayed, they organized, they governed captured territory, and most astonishingly, they won. Small mobile forces defeated larger imperial armies. How? Speed, unity of command, high morale rooted in religious conviction, and the element of surprise. But also something less dramatic and more structural. The populations of Syria and Iraq were not always loyal to Constantinople or Ctesiphon. Religious divisions ran deep. Many local Christians in Byzantine lands resented imperial religious policies. Tax burdens were heavy. To some communities, the new rulers did not initially appear as annihilators, but as alternatives. And that perception would accelerate everything. In 634 AD, Abu Bakr died, after only 2 years as caliph. But in those 2 years, he had done something extraordinary. He prevented collapse. He unified Arabia under centralized authority.
and he set armies in motion beyond the peninsula. His successor would inherit not a fragile movement, but a mobilized state on the edge of two exhausted empires. His name was Umar ibn al-Khattab, and under his leadership, expansion would transform from bold raids into unstoppable conquest. Because the next battles would not just test Arabia's unity, they would decide the fate of Rome's eastern provinces and the survival of Persia itself. And once the first imperial army fell, there would be no turning back.
The year is 634 AD. The desert winds are no longer carrying only merchants and caravans. They are carrying armies. And now, at the helm of this expanding force, stands a tall, stern-faced leader, a man known for discipline, austerity, and uncompromising justice. Umar ibn al-Khattab. He does not dress like an emperor. He does not live in a palace. But the decisions he is about to make will shake the foundations of two superpowers. Because within 2 years, one of the greatest imperial armies on earth would collapse. When Umar takes office, Muslim forces are already probing Byzantine Syria. Several skirmishes have occurred, but nothing yet decisive. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius understands the threat. At first, these Arab forces seem like desert raiders, annoying but manageable. But reports from the frontier grow alarming. They are disciplined, they are unified, they fight with unusual cohesion. Heraclius gathers what sources describe as a massive coalition army, possibly tens of thousands of troops drawn from across the empire: Greeks, Armenians, Christian Arabs. The goal is simple: crush this uprising before it becomes a revolution. The confrontation will take place near the Yarmouk River in present-day Syria. And the man commanding the Muslim forces? A strategist already feared across Arabia, Khalid ibn al-Walid, nicknamed the Sword of God.
What happened at Yarmouk would astonish historians for centuries. In 636 AD, the two armies meet. Byzantium has numbers, armor, cavalry, experience. The Muslims have mobility, cohesion, unified command, and something harder to quantify: conviction. For 6 days, battle rages across dusty plains and ravines. At key moments, Khalid redeploys cavalry with stunning speed, reinforcing weak points, launching counterattacks, preventing collapse. The Byzantines attempt to encircle. They fail. Windstorms blind the imperial lines, morale falters, coordination breaks down. And then, the collapse begins. Units retreat, panic spreads, soldiers fall into the ravines near the river. By the end of the Battle of Yarmouk, the Byzantine field army in Syria is shattered. Heraclius, watching from afar, reportedly whispers a farewell to Syria. "Peace be upon you, O Syria. What a beautiful land you are for the enemy." Because at the very same time, to the east, another empire was about to suffer an even greater shock. And Persia would not recover.
While Syria trembled, the east was already cracking. Beyond the Euphrates lay the ancient empire of Persia, the Sasanian superpower that had rivaled Rome for 4 centuries. Its capital, Ctesiphon, glittered with vaulted palaces and royal ceremony. Its monarch, Yazdegerd III, claimed a lineage stretching back to kings who styled themselves King of Kings. On parchment, Persia looked eternal. In reality, it was unraveling. Because the Persian army that would face the Muslims was already weakened before the first sword was drawn. Decades of war with Byzantium had drained Persia's treasury. Plague had swept through its population. Court intrigue had turned deadly. In just 4 years, multiple rulers were assassinated or overthrown. When Yazdegerd III ascended the throne in 632 AD, he was still a teenager. An empire of seasoned generals, led by a boy king. Meanwhile, Muslim forces crossed into Iraq. At first, the clashes were small. Probing engagements, cavalry raids, testing the edges. Then came the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636 AD. The Persian commander was a veteran aristocrat, Rostam Farrokzad. He commanded war elephants, heavy cavalry, and disciplined infantry. Against him stood Arab forces under Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. The battlefield stretched across flat Mesopotamian plains. And towering above the chaos, Persian war elephants. For Arab horses, unused to such beasts, the sight was terrifying. Lines broke, riders faltered.
For a moment, it looked as though Persia would hold. But adaptation came quickly. Muslim fighters targeted the elephants' eyes. They cut the harnesses. They disrupted the formations. The elephants panicked. Persian lines wavered, and in the confusion, Rostam was killed. Accounts differ whether he fell in battle or drowned during retreat, but his death shattered morale. The Persian army collapsed. Within months, Muslim forces advanced toward Ctesiphon itself, the royal capital, the symbol of Persian grandeur. Yazdegerd fled eastward, and when Muslim troops entered the city, they found imperial treasures, carpets, silver, gold, symbols of centuries of accumulated wealth. But this wasn't just plunder, because once Ctesiphon fell, something irreversible had happened. An empire that had stood for over 400 years was no longer defending its heartland. And Persia's final stand was still to come.
By 637 AD, two shockwaves had already rippled across the known world. Syria was slipping from Byzantine control. Ctesiphon, the Persian imperial capital, had fallen. But empires do not die quietly. They resist. They regroup. They make one last stand. And Persia was not finished, because the final confrontation would decide whether the Sasanian Empire survived or vanished from history. After the fall of Ctesiphon, Yazdegerd III fled east, first to Media, then deeper into the Iranian plateau. Loyal nobles rallied what forces they could. This would not be a defensive skirmish. This would be a national survival effort. The decisive battle came in 642 AD at Nahavand. Later Muslim chroniclers would call it Fath al-Futu, the victory of victories. The Persians fortified mountain positions. They hoped terrain would compensate for diminished numbers. They aimed to trap the advancing Arab army in narrow approaches. For weeks, the armies faced each other in tense stalemate. No easy breakthrough, no obvious weakness.
And if the Muslims failed here, everything gained in Mesopotamia could unravel. The Muslim commander, Al-Nu'man ibn Muqarrin, devised a risky plan. Feign retreat, draw the Persians out from their fortified positions, then strike in open terrain. It was dangerous. If the feint failed, they would be overwhelmed. But it worked. Persian forces pursued. Their formation loosened. Momentum shifted. In the chaos of open battle, Al-Nu'man was killed, but the Muslim ranks did not collapse. Instead, they pressed forward. By the end of Nahavand, organized Persian resistance was broken. The Sasanian Empire, once Rome's equal, disintegrated into regional holdouts. Yazdegerd III would spend years fleeing eastward, seeking allies, attempting to rebuild authority. He would die in 651 AD, reportedly murdered near Merv by a local miller. And with him, ended the Sasanian line. In less than 2 decades, a superpower had vanished. From 632 to roughly 650 AD, less than 20 years, Muslim forces had taken control of Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Persia. This wasn't gradual drift, it was acceleration. Western historians, from Edward Gibbon onward, often described this expansion as astonishing, even inexplicable. How could lightly equipped desert armies defeat imperial systems centuries old? The answer lies not in a single cause, but in convergence. Exhausted empires, religious divisions inside Byzantine lands, political instability in Persia, highly mobile cavalry tactics, unified leadership under the early caliphs, and a powerful ideological drive that fused faith with state building. But expansion was not only about battlefield victory, it was about governance. Because conquest can be fast, but holding territory, that is much harder. Under Umar ibn al-Khattab, administrative structures began forming rapidly. Garrison cities like Kufa and Basra were established in Iraq. Fustad emerged in Egypt. Rather than dispersing tribal warriors across conquered populations, they were organized into military settlements, maintaining cohesion and preventing fragmentation. Local populations were often allowed to keep their religion in exchange for tax, jizya, under a structured system. In many regions, administrative continuity was preserved. Former Byzantine and Persian bureaucrats continued working, now under new rulers. This was not chaos, it was institutionalization.
And as the Caliphate stabilized its new territories, its ambitions did not slow. Because to the west lay North Africa, to the east, Central Asia, and to the north, the heartlands of Byzantium still remained. The rise of the Caliphate was no longer a regional phenomenon. It was becoming a world-altering force. And soon, internal tensions would test whether this meteoric rise could survive its own success.
By the mid-640s, the impossible had happened. The Byzantine Empire had lost Syria and Egypt. The Sasanian Empire had collapsed. The Caliphate now stretched across 3 continents, from the deserts of Arabia to the Nile to the mountains of Persia. It was a rise so sudden that even modern historians struggle to find a parallel. And yet, the greatest threat to the Caliphate would not come from Rome, nor from Persia. It would come from within. Because expansion can unite people, but power can divide them. In 644 AD, Umar ibn al-Khattab was assassinated in Medina by a Persian captive. The empire had just reached breathtaking heights, and suddenly, its architect was gone. His successor, Uthman ibn Affan, inherited a state larger than anything Arabia had ever imagined. Under Uthman, expansion continued. North Africa, parts of Central Asia, naval victories against Byzantium in the Mediterranean. But cracks began to form. Unlike Umar, who had ruled with austere simplicity and tight administrative control, Uthman faced growing criticism over appointments. Many accused him of favoring members of his own clan, the Umayyads. In distant provinces like Egypt and Kufa, resentment simmered. Veterans who had fought in early campaigns felt sidelined. New converts demanded fair treatment. Political expectations were shifting. This was no longer a tribal confederation. It was an empire.
And empires magnify grievances. By 656 AD, unrest turned violent. Rebels from Egypt marched to Medina. They surrounded the caliph's house. For weeks, tension hung heavy over the city where Islam had been born. Then, in a shocking act, Uthman was killed while reading the Quran. For the first time in Islamic history, a sitting caliph had been assassinated by fellow Muslims. The unity forged in crisis now fractured under success, and what followed would be known as the First Fitna, the First Civil War. Because the question was no longer about conquest, it was about legitimacy. Leadership passed to Ali ibn Abi Talib, cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet, but not everyone accepted him. Among the challengers was Muawiyah I, governor of Syria and a relative of Uthman. Muawiyah demanded justice for Uthman's murder before recognizing Ali's authority. The dispute escalated. 2 massive armies, both Muslim, faced each other at the Battle of Siffin in 657 AD. Think about that. Just 25 years after the Prophet's death,
The same community that had shattered two superpowers was now fighting itself. At Siffin, fighting raged brutally along the Euphrates. When Muawiyah's forces appeared close to defeat, his troops reportedly raised Qurans on their lances, calling for arbitration. A psychological masterstroke. Ali's camp fractured over whether to accept arbitration. He agreed. But the decision weakened him. Some of his own supporters broke away, becoming the Kharijites, condemning both sides.
The caliphate was no longer united by expansion. It was splintered by ideology. In 661 AD, Ali was assassinated by a Kharijite in Kufa. With his death, Muawiyah consolidated power and established the Umayyad dynasty, shifting the capital to Damascus. The caliphate transformed. It was no longer a community-led leadership model emerging from Medina. It became a hereditary empire. For some, this was necessary stability. For others, it was betrayal of the original vision. And yet, despite civil war, assassination, and ideological fracture, expansion did not stop. In fact, under the Umayyads, it accelerated. West into North Africa, across the Strait of Gibraltar into Iberia, east into Central Asia, and toward the borders of India. The empire survived its first internal implosion, but at a cost. The political and theological divisions born in this period would echo for centuries, shaping Sunni and Shia identities, influencing regional power struggles, and defining Islamic political thought. The rise of the caliphate was not a straight line. It was conquest followed by crisis, unity followed by fracture. And yet, the world map continued to change, because now the caliphate was not just expanding by momentum, it was becoming a global superpower, and its next transformation would reshape civilization itself. By the late 7th century, the caliphate was no longer fragile. It was formidable. Under the Umayyad dynasty, founded by Muawiyah I, the capital shifted to Damascus. The center of gravity moved north, closer to Byzantine frontiers, closer to Mediterranean trade, closer to imperial ambition. And with that shift, the caliphate began to look less like a revolutionary movement and more like a world empire. But the speed of expansion was about to reach its most astonishing phase. In the west, Muslim armies pushed steadily across North Africa. Resistance came from Byzantine garrisons and Berber tribes, sometimes fierce, sometimes fluid, but momentum built year by year. Then, in 711 AD, a commander named Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed a narrow strait separating Africa from Europe. The place would later bear his name, Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar. With perhaps 7,000 troops, later reinforced, Tariq marched into the Visigothic kingdom of Iberia. At the Battle of Guadalete, King Roderick was defeated. Within a few years, most of the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim control. Think about that. From Arabia in 632 to Spain by 720. Less than 90 years. And in the east, the frontier was moving just as fast. Umayyad forces pressed into Central Asia, across the Oxus River, confronting Turkic powers and Tang Chinese influence. In 751 AD, at the Battle of Talas, Muslim forces clashed with troops of the Tang dynasty. The battle itself was not enormous in scale, but its consequences were profound. Chinese prisoners reportedly transmitted paper-making techniques westward, a technology that would later fuel Islamic scholarship and, eventually, Europe's intellectual revolutions. Meanwhile, to the west, the expansion met its limit. In 732 AD, near Tours in modern France, Muslim forces under Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi encountered Frankish troops led by Charles Martel. The Battle of Tours, or Poitiers, ended with a Frankish victory. The Muslim advance into Western Europe slowed. Historians debate its long-term significance, but symbolically, it marked a frontier. Yet, even where expansion halted, consolidation deepened. By the early 8th century, the Umayyad Caliphate stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of India and China.
an empire larger than Rome at its peak in contiguous territory. Governance evolved. Arabic became the administrative language across vast regions. Coinage was standardized. Bureaucracy expanded. Under Caliph Abd al-Malik, monumental architecture symbolized imperial confidence, including the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. The Caliphate was no longer reacting. It was defining an era. But rapid expansion carried hidden strain. Diverse populations, ethnic tensions between Arab elites and non-Arab converts, heavy taxation in frontier regions, growing dissatisfaction among groups who felt marginalized.
And in the east, revolution was brewing. In 750 AD, the Abbasid movement, drawing support from non-Arab Muslims and Persian converts, overthrew the Umayyads in a violent uprising. The Abbasids claimed to restore justice and inclusivity. The capital shifted again, this time to Baghdad, founded in 762. Baghdad would become one of the greatest cities in the world. The era of pure conquest gave way to something different: intellectual flowering. Trade networks spanning from West Africa to India. Translation movements preserving Greek philosophy. Advances in mathematics, medicine, astronomy. The empire that began in desert caravans had become a civilization engine. But here's the paradox. The speed of conquest that stunned the world was only the first act. Because reshaping the world is not just about territory. It's about ideas. And in the centuries that followed, the legacy of those early decades would ripple far beyond battlefields. The Caliphate had risen faster than anyone expected. Now, it would redefine knowledge itself.
When people think of the early Caliphate, they picture maps, arrows sweeping across continents, territories changing color, empires falling. But the deeper impact of this rise was not just territorial. It was structural, cultural, civilizational. Because in less than a century, a new world system had emerged. And its consequences would shape Europe, Africa, and Asia for centuries. Under the Abbasids, with their capital in Baghdad, the Islamic world became the center of a vast commercial and intellectual network. Merchants traveled from West Africa to China. Spices, silk, gold, and ideas flowed along interconnected routes. The Mediterranean, once dominated by Rome, became a shared economic zone between Christian and Muslim powers. In cities like Damascus, Cairo, and Cordoba, architecture blended Persian, Byzantine, and Arabian elements into something new. But perhaps the most profound transformation came through knowledge. In Baghdad, the House of Wisdom gathered scholars from across the empire. Greek philosophical works, Aristotle, Plato, were translated into Arabic. Persian administrative traditions were adapted. Indian numerals were refined into what we now call Arabic numerals. Algebra, from Al-Jab, took form in the works of scholars like Al-Khwarizmi. Medical texts synthesized Greek, Persian, and Arab knowledge, later transmitted to Europe through Spain and Sicily.
Without these translations, would Europe's Renaissance have unfolded the same way? It's a question historians still debate. What is certain is this: the speed of early conquest created a zone of stability across 3 continents. A shared language of administration, Arabic, facilitated communication. Trade wealth funded scholarship, and religious institutions provided social cohesion. Yet this golden image was never without tension. Regional governors grew powerful. Frontier provinces demanded autonomy. Ethnic hierarchies persisted. Succession disputes reappeared. By the 9th and 10th centuries, political unity fragmented. Independent dynasties emerged in Spain, North Africa, and Central Asia. The caliph remained symbolically powerful, but practical authority often dispersed. And then, new forces appeared on the horizon. Turkic military powers rose within the Islamic world. Crusader armies arrived from Europe in the late 11th century, and in the 13th century, a storm from the east. In 1258, Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad. The caliph was killed. The city that had once symbolized intellectual glory was devastated. It seemed, for a moment, as though the caliphate's legacy had ended in fire. But history is rarely so simple, because even after political collapse, the cultural and religious framework endured. Islamic law continued evolving. Trade networks adapted. New empires, Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal, would later draw upon caliphal models. The early caliphate had created a template, a fusion of faith and governance, of mobility and administration, of conquest and scholarship. And perhaps its most enduring impact was psychological. It demonstrated that world order could shift rapidly, that peripheral societies could become central, that exhausted superpowers could fall not only from outside attack, but internal weakness. The rise of the caliphate was not just about military genius, it was about timing, about structural opportunity, about unity at a moment when rivals were fractured. And that lesson echoes beyond the 7th century.
So, how do modern historians explain it? How did a movement born in 7th century Arabia expand faster than Rome, faster than Alexander, faster than nearly any empire before it? For centuries, Western observers struggled with the question. In the 18th century, the historian Edward Gibbon called the Islamic conquests one of the most memorable revolutions which have impressed a new and lasting character on the nations of the globe. But even he wrestled with the speed. Was it religious zeal? Military innovation? Imperial weakness? The modern answer is more layered. Because the rise of the caliphate wasn't driven by one cause, but by convergence. First, geopolitics. By 630 AD, both the Byzantine and Sasanian empires had just concluded a catastrophic generation-long war. Entire provinces had changed hands repeatedly. Tax systems were strained. Armies were exhausted. Plague outbreaks had reduced populations. When Muslim armies appeared, they did not confront empires at peak strength. They encountered systems already destabilized. Second, military structure. Early Muslim forces were highly mobile, light cavalry, flexible command, decentralized maneuver with unified strategic direction. Unlike imperial armies tied to supply lines and heavy logistics, Arab forces moved quickly across familiar terrain. And critically, leadership was centralized. The caliphate did not fracture command among competing generals. Strategic direction flowed from Medina and later Damascus. But perhaps the most underestimated factor was social integration. In many conquered regions, local populations were not annihilated or forcibly converted. Administrative continuity was preserved. Tax systems were often adjusted rather than reinvented. Non-Muslim communities were incorporated under structured legal frameworks. This reduced resistance in many regions, particularly where Byzantine religious policies had already alienated local Christians. Third, ideology. Religious conviction mattered, not in the simplistic sense of fanaticism, but as cohesion. Belief created discipline. Discipline created unity. Unity created strategic clarity. Historians like Fred Donner argue that the early movement may have functioned as a broad community of believers, not yet sharply defined by later sectarian boundaries. That inclusivity may have smoothed early expansion. But here's the deeper insight. The rise of the caliphate shows how quickly global balance can shift when three conditions align: a unifying ideology, competent leadership, and rival powers in decline. It wasn't inevitable. If Persia had stabilized politically, if Byzantine had fully recovered militarily, if internal unity had collapsed earlier, history might look very different. Instead, within a single generation, a new civilizational axis formed, and the consequences are still visible in language, law, architecture, philosophy, and geopolitics. The early caliphate was not an anomaly. It was a case study in how power moves. The rise of the caliphate was not just a chapter in Islamic history. It was a turning point in world history. In less than a century, a new empire redrew the map from the Atlantic to the borders of China, defeated two superpowers, and built a civilizational bridge between ancient knowledge and the medieval world. And yet, this was only the beginning, because after expansion came fragmentation, after unity came dynasties, after Baghdad's golden age came fire and invasion. And one day, a new power would claim the title of Caliph, rising from Anatolia to challenge Europe itself. If you want to understand how the story continues, from the Abbasids to the Ottomans, from crusades to gunpowder empires, then you're going to want to see what comes next. Like and subscribe, because history doesn't move in straight lines. It surges, it fractures, it returns in unexpected forms. And in our next episode, we explore how the Caliphate's legacy reshaped medieval Europe and helped ignite the Renaissance. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine standing in 630 AD. Two superpowers dominate your world. Their borders seem permanent, their armies unstoppable. Now fast forward 20 years. One empire is gone, the other permanently weakened. A new power commands 3 continents. No one in Constantinople predicted it. No Persian noble foresaw it. History rarely warns before it changes. The rise of the Caliphate reminds us, the next world-shifting force often begins where no one is looking. And when it moves fast.